Next, we are going to move from the plant a little more towards the animal. And Johnny Rogers is going to talk to us a little bit about forage animal demand. So Johnny is the educational coordinator of the Amazing Grazing Program. He's the director of the North Carolina Beef Cattle Improvement Program, where he provides leadership for the NC Bull Test Program. Johnny has organized many research projects and educational events for Amazing Grazing. He manages Rogers Cattle Company with his spouse, Sharon, where they raise Red Angus cattle and Katahdin sheep. Johnny and Sharon graze several solar farms with their sheep as well. Johnny's a national leader in the Red Angus breed, and he is known internationally for his educational work with sheep producers grazing solar farms. So with that, Johnny, take it away.
Thank you, Paul. I appreciate that. Appreciate everybody being on this evening. And I'll just tell you up front, I did not get any live animals for demonstration like Dr. Harmon did. So I'm sorry about that, but we will go through with our slides and talk a little bit about animal forage demand. I always like to think about grazing systems on the forage production as being the supply side. And then our animal requirements are what puts demand on our forages. So we'll kind of wade through that this evening. So as we get started, I kind of wanted to call our attention to the weight and number of livestock that we have on our farms. And that really kind of should relate to the carrying capacity we have. And we all probably know that carrying capacity is that stocking rate, that maximum stocking rate that we could have on our farms that would not degrade the resource of forage or water or soil or anything else and meet the needs of our animals. Challenging part about carrying capacity is it's always a moving target based on how much rainfall that we have, over a given period of time. But we do know that stocking rate is something that we do need to try to marry up with our carrying capacity as best we can to avoid overgrazing and the need to feed a lot of harvested forages. So again, that matching stocking rate to carrying capacity, that's kind of a dance that we all try to do as grazers. And I want to make the point that it's not just about the number of livestock we have. Some people say, well, I graze 25 cows. Yeah, but how big are those cows? Are they 1,000-pound cows or 1,500-pound cows? That can affect their nutritional requirements. But either way, all that can be, part of the management that we have in grazing systems. And then we need to think about livestock nutritional requirements. It varies with species, class, sex, size, breed. And we'll talk a little bit about those. And again, we probably won't touch on all of them this evening, but we certainly will touch on the ones that I kind of distilled down that I think are really important. I know when I was coming along through 4-H and FFA and judging contests, you'd always get to the sheep and goat class. My coach would always say, judge them like they're little cattle, because he knew I had cattle experience. And that worked pretty well in a judging contest. But when it comes to feeding our small ruminants, I always like to make the point that they are unique species that have their own set of requirements and their own set of things that we need to think about when we're grazing our small ruminants. I do want to say that this evening, I want to focus mostly on the ruminant side of things. Here in a couple of weeks, Dr. Siciliano will talk quite a bit about horses, and Dr. Weaver will go a little more in depth with sheep and goat grazing systems here in a couple of weeks as well. But we do need to be cognizant of the species that we're dealing with on our farms. And of course, some of us may have multiple species that can add some complexity, but numerous benefits to a grazing system. So you've already seen this information. Dr. Poor shared that. Looking at the dietary preferences, again, of cattle and sheep and goats. And you can see that cattle, certainly they're grazers. They like grass, and goats are on the other end of the spectrum, being heavy browsers, and sheep can follow somewhere in between. And I always encourage producers to think about this as they're building their farm and their grazing system. What resources do you have on your farm? If you have mostly brush, goats are a great fit. If you have a lot of forbs, sheep can certainly be a great companion grazer to a cattle operation. And of course, we know we have a lot of beef cattle operations out there in our landscape. I tried to summarize just some species nutrient requirements and compare those just to kind of give you a rough idea of, animals that are dry, non-lactating, just how much dry matter intake, whether that's in pounds or percentage of their body weight. And then the energy needs of those classes of animals expressed as total digestible nutrients, and then of course crude protein. And you can kind of see that our small ruminants do have a little higher protein demand, maybe a little higher energy demands in some cases. And certainly when you get into lactation, you get ewes and does that may have, twins or even triplets. They need a lot more intake, in terms of percentage of their body weight, as well as the quality. And when I say quality, I'm talking about, nutrient to the value of those forages. So it gives you a little bit of flavor for that. I thought it would be instructive tonight to maybe back up just a little bit and talk a little bit about ruminant digestion, because I want to make sure we were all kind of on the same page. Ruminant animals are, really great. They have a marvelous digestive system that's really unique, that 4-compartment stomach. And they are different because they do ruminate, they do re-chew some of the forages that they ingest. And I just wanted you to kind of keep in mind the flow of grass and forage and other feedstuffs that come into the rumen and the reticulum, and then go through the omasum, the abomasum, and then on out through the intestines, and small and large, and of course end up as fecal material. But just keep that in mind. And we're going to talk tonight about some things that may speed that process up, and then some things that may slow it down or even stop it entirely. So just keep that in mind a little bit. And here's kind of a diagram, and I apologize for being kind of busy, but I thought it would be something we need to look at. Ruminant animals can have the ability to adapt a wide range of feedstuffs. And of course, here principally we're talking about forages, but they can digest a lot of different types of concentrates and feed mixtures if they're given time to adapt to the ration. So we have all those forages and maybe some types of supplement going into the diet, and they're exposed to microbial fermentation there in the rumen and the reticulum. And ruminant animals derive most of their energy from short chain fatty acids that come from this fermentation process of these microbes digesting this fiber. Also, you have this microbial biomass that's constantly turning over, bacteria, protozoa, and fungi that are present in the rumen. And, what happens to them in a lot of cases is, if they don't die off naturally in the rumen, they're actually washed down through the rest of the other compartments of the stomach, and they're actually digested. So they become a protein source for the host animal, whether it's sheep, goats, or cattle. And again, those short chain fatty acids, they provide some energy there for the host. And then we derive animal performance based on the balance of the energy and protein that's provided by this diet relative to what the animals actually need. So what are some things that could interrupt this? Well, let's say we're on a very poor quality diet that is maybe low in crude protein, but adequate in energy. Well, if you don't have adequate protein, you're not going to have the microbial biomass, so you're not going to meet their nitrogen needs. Let's don't worry about the host animal for a minute. Let's think about the microbes. And then all of a sudden your microbial population is not large enough, so that reduces fiber digestion. So then you also have an energy problem then. So you can see how that can kind of spiral out of control in a direction that we don't want it to go. So we're going to talk a little bit about forage quality tonight and how we can maintain intake. And we'll also talk a little bit about supplementation programs. So this sums it up pretty good. In order to achieve the meat, milk, or fiber performance that we're looking for with our ruminants, we've got to have good forage intake, and we're going to talk about that quite a bit. And then that forage has to have the proper nutritive value or nutrient balance to meet the needs of the rumen microbes and meet the needs of our animals. So when I started thinking and looking into factors that affect forage intake, it's really the same factors that affect animal nutritional requirements. And again, this is applicable across species, but a lot of these are cattle examples. Body weight's a critical deal, how much weight that we're looking to gain. There are some breed and sex differences. Of course, younger animals are smaller, have less room and capacity, so they're going to need a higher quality diet. Temperature is something we'll talk about here in a few previous slides, as well as overall activity and, of course, physiological stage. Milk production is very nutrient intensive. So I think because we live here in the South, and of course, I know we have a wide variety of audiences this evening, but the temperature can affect forage intake for our cattle. And here in the South, we don't have a lot of nighttime cooling. So it can get very hot, which reduces intake. And you can see cattle, this is a cattle example. Cattle are most comfortable in that 60 to 78 degree range. So that's 100% level of intake. As it gets colder than that, in colder climates, they respond by consuming more. As it gets hotter, they will actually reduce their feed intake. They just don't eat quite as much. So what do we need to know as grazers about that? Well, we need to know they probably need a higher quality diet that's more nutrient dense, but to compensate for that lower amount that they're consuming. Hair shedding is something that we look at in our herd quite a bit, both with cattle as well as small ruminants. And those that hold on to their winter hair coat a long time, they're more subject to heat stress. So we go ahead and like to have cattle that have those lower hair scores and go ahead and shed that winter hair coat out. And we just see them performing quite a bit better. So how can we determine if our livestock are achieving adequate forage intake? So if I walk out onto a farm, first time out there, what am I going to look for? And I think here's 4 big things that I like to look for. And the first one will be forage available. And you can see here in this picture, forage availability is not a problem for these lambs in this case. And I look at the available forage both in quantity and quality. Dr. Harmon did a good job of talking about those plants, and as they mature, they're going to be lower in nutritional value, and that may lower the overall intake and certainly lower nutritional value. How are the animals behaving when they see humans? Are they coming up, vocalizing, wanting to move to the next pasture? Do they act hungry? Those are some key things: gut feel and fecal consistency, and we'll take a deeper look at each one of those. So I thought it would be good if we talked a little bit about forage differences in available forage. So here we got a herd of cattle. You got some black baldy cows here, that's herd A, and you got some red cows and calves over here in herd B. So when you start to look at these 2 differences, one thing we know about cows, they're only going to spend about 8 hours grazing, 8 hours of rumination, and then 8 hours of rest. During times of limited forage, they may stretch that to 10 hours of grazing, trying to get their forage intake needs met. But for the most part, they have to have that 8 hours of rumination. So that's just a part of the physiology of the animal. When you get animals like the ones here in herd A, they may change the biting rate. Typically, cattle will graze at about 30 bites per minute. That's just how many bites they will take. During times of limited forage, they may increase that to 80 bites per minute, but they cannot sustain that level of biting activity over a long period of time. So the one I really want us to think about is the bite size. Dr. Poore talked a little bit about the mouth structure of our animals. And of course, we know cattle, they like this situation in herd B here. They like that long, grass where they can reach out there with their tongue and shear that off with their dental pad and go from there. So that biting size is something that we can dictate with our grazing program. And again, try to avoid situations like we hear with herd B, where it's very short grazing conditions. And animal behavior and gut feel. When I go out and look at animal behavior and how much gut feel they have, again, you can see here on the screen, we're looking at that area behind their last rib, right in front of their pelvis on their left side. The reason we look at the left side is because that's where the rumen would be, in that animal. So when that is full of forage, it can be very distended. You don't see that little triangle you see there in this animal. You see the other animal here, OC3. I didn't get off to the side of her and get a very good picture, but you can kind of see she's got pretty good feel and in pretty good body condition, and certainly plenty of available forages. So the reason I think ambient temperature and time of day comes into play during hot weather, cattle will graze more at night. Typically, when cattle get up in the morning, they will have the biggest meal of the day, during the morning hours. So they may look a little empty first thing in the morning. So if they looked a little empty, I might come back and check them a little bit later. Oh yeah, by the way, sometimes livestock learn how to bluff humans. They like to fake hunger because they get into the cycle of going to new grass every time they see you. Don't fall for that. Look at their gut feel. Look at their fecal consistency here in just a little bit, and don't let them bluff you into sending them to new grass. They can sing a pretty pitiful song sometimes. So the last thing would be fecal consistency, and you look up here on the top left, and that's probably something you're starting to see this time of year if you walk out into your pastures. That's a very loose fecal consistency with very high quality, high moisture grass that those cattle are eating, typical of spring growth. If you look down here at the bottom middle, you start to see a diet that is very fibrous. Remember when we talked about our ruminant digestion? This would be a great example of a low quality, probably low protein, low energy diet that has a lot of fiber, and it's just not getting digested very well. And over here on the top right, well, this is the one that's just right. It's a diet that's very well balanced, got plenty of nutritional value, good rate of passage probably in those cattle, and I would predict they do have a high level of performance with that type of fecal consistency. So in the effort to help you remember this, the one on the top left, let's call that maybe pancake batter. The one here in the center, we'll call that a sheet cake. And the one over here that's just right, that's pumpkin pie. So every Thanksgiving, now guess who you're going to think about? You'll think about me probably. Okay, so once we kind of look at our animals' needs, and we know we have to have some benchmarks for animal demand as far as intake of dry matter. We can take a herd of cattle here, and this is just an example, herd of 70 cows, some replacement heifers, and 3 bulls. And then we can take a period of time. It could be a year, it could be a 100-day feeding period. And you can see I went through and I looked at the percentage of body weight of dry matter intake for each of these different classes. And then I can come up with an overall need for our herd. So then I can go back and see how that marries up with the forage supply that I have going forward or expect to have. And then I can make some decisions based on that. Body condition scoring. We need a way to benchmark our nutritional program over time. Those indicators for forage intake I just talked about, they tell me how good a job you've done over the last 24 hours or so with your nutrition program. Body condition score will give me a chance to look at how you're doing with your nutrition program over the previous months. And it'll become obvious why that's true here in just a moment. So it helps us track performance over time. Again, provide us some benchmarks. For cattle, it's a 1 to 9 system. And really what you're doing here is, and we won't go into detail of the all 1 to 9 of the scores tonight. There's plenty of information available. And if you can't find it, just get in touch with me and I'll be help you to track it down. But really what you're looking for here are fat reserves on the body of the animal. So, how much fat do they have? Typically 1 to 3 we would call a thin condition, 4 to 6 would be moderate, and then 7 to 9 would be animals that are very fleshy and even fat. So weight differences between body condition scores, it's somewhere between 7 and 8% of the animal's body weight, the difference from one score to the next. So think about this. If you're going from a 4 to a 5 condition score, it's somewhere around 70 to 140 pounds, depending on how big the animal is. For practical purposes, I like to use 90 pounds, and because that's going to make the math here real easy when we start trying to manage body condition score, and here's why. So if I want to take a cow from a 4 to a 5, she needs to gain 90 pounds. If I have 90 days to gain 90 pounds, the average daily gain needs to be 1 pound per day. Pretty easy that can be done, on most forage-based rations. Now, what if we go out there and we decide, oh my gracious, our cows are too thin and we've got 30 days to take them from a 4 to a 5? Well, all of a sudden they've got to gain 3 pounds per day. A lot harder to do on a forage-based diet. Not impossible, but really difficult and really expensive, to do that. Probably going to need some type of supplementation to make that happen. So again, body condition scoring can help us track our nutritional performance over a period of months. And the reason we worry about body condition score so much is it's heavily influences pregnancy rate. So when we look at the body condition score at calving, a 2 to a 7, the condition score here in this particular study, you can see that we would like to be somewhere in that 6 range, to optimize pregnancy rate percentages in our cow herd. This is just a couple of pictures here to kind of show you body condition score 5 cows and body condition score 6 cows. And again, the changes are kind of subtle. And really the working range I see from most cow herds are somewhere in that 4 to 6, maybe 4 to 7 range on some really easy keeping kind of cows. So those are the ones you typically don't see, the really, really thin cows or the really fat ones, but you can run into some occasionally. So it's important to remember that body condition score does not have to stay the same year round. Okay, so this is an example of fall and spring calving herds and how their body condition score can go from a 6 down to a 5, on down to a 4, as the calves get weighing heavier on the cows, and then they kind of bounce back a little bit on spring grass to a 5 by the time you wean the calves. And then when calving rolls around next year for those fall calving cows, again, they're back to a 6. So again, don't, trap yourself into thinking that the animals have to be in a body condition score 5 to a 6 year round. Some of them can get thinner than that. Let's talk a little bit about small ruminants. They use a body condition scoring system that's a 1 to 5 scale, so a little bit different. And typically you're looking at, 2 to 3.5, is kind of the ideal condition for our small ruminants. And I know for our Katahdin hair sheep, it's real easy to get them into those 4 ranges pretty quick. So they can get a little fleshy on us out here on pretty good forages. So is it practical for large herds to track body condition score on their herds? And I would argue that it is, but I think you need to set your target a little different for large herds. And I'm talking about herds probably of 50 or more. It's not necessary for you to write down the condition score on every individual cow, but you can just score maybe a percentage, maybe about 70% of your herd. I like to set up a table like this that has the date that they were sampled and each one of these individual body condition scores. And then I just make tick marks. And then I can go back and do a little bit of calculation and say, okay, I've got a herd that's, 70% body condition score 6s, 10% body condition score 5s, and so many, condition score 4s. So that would help me track it over a large herd. So just because you have a really big herd doesn't mean that you can't track body condition score. If you're working cattle through a chute and a handling system, sure, you can go ahead and score each one of them individually and keep those records. What happens when your forage doesn't meet the needs of your livestock? Well, we don't really want to have reduction of performance there. So in most cases, we look at providing some type of supplement to help achieve our performance goals. And the one I see the most often that's kind of talked about quite a bit, and there's a lot of debate about how are the best ways to meet the vitamin and mineral needs of livestock out on pastures. And I get a lot of questions about, different types of mineral, different programs, and we can certainly talk about that during the Q&A. But usually forages that are grown in most regions, especially the east, southeast, they can be deficient in one or more minerals. So most experience from producers as well as good research from land grants have shown that we do need a good balanced mineral program to help optimize performance in our cow herds. And we can see some deficiencies, signs, really it kind of catches us on, some low body condition, low breeding rates, maybe some rough hair coats. And then Then some health problems, it kind of affects immune function pretty good. Common deficiencies that we see in this area are salt, copper, zinc, and selenium. So we need to make sure that our minerals that we're providing to our cattle, our free choice mineral, are sufficient in these four minerals. There are some species considerations that I'm sure Dr. Weaver will cover in a couple of weeks, but copper, tolerance with our small ruminants is an issue. Urinary calculi can also be a problem. So the calcium phosphorus ratio is a big deal. And then selenium, particularly deficiency as it relates to white muscle disease, can be a challenge with our small ruminants. So it's something we need to keep in our minds. So what about protein and energy supplementation? Remember, we talked about during our ruminant digestion part where, we may be a little limited on protein, and that kind of throws the whole thing out of whack just a little bit. So here's a good example of why we need to test our forages, especially if we're dealing with harvested forages like our hays and our silage and our haylage. Let's make sure we get a nutrient analysis on those so we're not shooting in the dark or guessing. Nutrition programs for our livestock are way too important and way too expensive to just guess at what our nutritive value is in our base forage. So let's make sure we get nutrient analysis, and then if we find out for our dry beef cows that crude protein is in that less than 7% range, then sure, a protein supplement is warranted, and certainly a nutritionist can help you design a program that would be appropriate and meet the needs of your animals. We've already talked about our small ruminants may need a diet that's a little higher in crude protein. And again, we're not just feeding the cattle. We are making sure we have a good nitrogen source for our ruminant microbes. Here's some good news about protein supplementation is that in many cases, you don't have to feed that daily. You can feed that as little as one time a week, and it can work very well. Delivery cost kind of becomes it's not just the cost of the feed itself, but it's the cost of the feeding, getting it to the animals on a daily basis. And of course, there's tubs and lick tanks and a lot of different things we could talk about there as far as, delivery of those products, whether it's self-fed or hand-fed. And again, access to all livestock. Make sure you have enough bunk space. If you're feeding so much per head per day, make sure all your animals have access to that. A little bit about energy supplementation, and a lot of times protein and energy supplements are in a combined form. Forage, most of the energy for your livestock, especially your brood cows, your does, and your ewes, that should come from your base forage, not from necessarily an energy type supplement. Growing livestock, our stocker calves, replacement heifers, young lambs, young kids, sure, they may need some energy and protein supplementation for optimal performance during times when our forage isn't quite as good. One thing about if you find yourself relying on a lot of energy supplementation, you may be overstocked. And or your livestock may not fit your production environment. You may be having animals that are trying to perform too much milk, too much growth, and they just don't fit your system. So just something to think about there and something to evaluate. Depending on what type of energy ingredients you're using, you can deliver these daily or as little as 3 times a week. There's some good research done by Dr. Poore and some others a few years ago that showed with some of our byproducts that 3 times a week works quite well. We've used it on our farm with some success. Again, how much does it cost to deliver it? And do all the critters have access to it as we go forward? So I think I can get this wrapped up here just a little bit. I would encourage you to use adaptive grazing management that Dr. Poore described to grow better forages. I think that'll go a long way to addressing our animal forage demand. Use those indicators for dry matter intake and body condition score to evaluate your nutrition program and make sure you're hitting that target for your animals. Watch the body condition score and it will allow you to make adjustments, but make sure you do it ahead of time before those critical periods like calving or breeding so you can make adjustments when it's not quite as expensive. Make sure you're using a supplementation program that's based on a forage analysis and that meets your animal's nutritional requirements. So don't just feed for the sake of feeding it. Make sure it'll hit the needs of your animals. So Paul, that's all I have this evening, and I look forward to the questions a little bit later.
All right, Johnny, thanks again. We'll come back hopefully and get some more good discussion. So we've talked a little bit in general about pasture ecology. We covered some information on the plants. Johnny just hit the animals, and we're going back to Deidre to kind of put this together with some principles of grazing management.